Okay, I think we should get started. Welcome everyone to the Global Extractivism session at the EXALT Symposium 2020. My name is Natacha and I'm from the coordination team at EXALT. Just a few housekeeping rules before we get started with the session. You can use the chat throughout the session, but questions and comments for the speakers will be addressed later, either at the end of the talks or at the end of the session. We are recording the event, and we hope that you will be sharing the discussions and the talks on social media. If you do, please use the hashtag EXALT Symposium and tag us at EXALT Research. And now I think I'll give the screen to Barry Gills to present our session. Thanks.
Right, thanks, Sana. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Barry Gills from the University of Helsinki and the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives Initiative. So I wanted to begin by saying that in our opening sessions earlier in the week, Eduardo Godinas made the point that words are meaningful. Concepts have consequences. And so that we should take great care in formulating them and in using them and judging the context in which we use them. So if, for example, here, there's extraction and extractivism, extractivisms, plural, global extractivism, global extractivisms, alternatives. Now, we have chosen very consciously to call our initiative global extractivisms and alternatives in the plural, because we are of the mind that there is a plurality of sectors of extractivism, of sites, of practices, of resistances, and of alternatives, and we make the proposition that there are dynamics that are global. There are social relations that are global, patterns that are global, and those are in some ways in need of more theorization and understanding. So we do, though, on the other hand, have a very strong commitment to working from the ground and at the ground, and because of the ground, as it were, with the object being, in the end, not just a critique of extractivisms, but to construct post-extractivist alternatives. And so we rely very much on researchers who do work on the ground with lived experiences in real places, with real people and real struggles. And that you aggregate those cases, let's say, in order to ask questions about causes, drivers, forces, alliances, processes, the role of various actors, including the state. Many things come into play. And so here today, we've got some excellent researchers we're going to present for you. And there's a kind of mixture here between sort of, somewhat younger researchers who are doing brilliant work and very experienced researchers, which we thought would be helpful, but all of whom are doing very, very useful work on the ground, as it were, and have been doing for many years. And then you'll hear about that today in a moment. So first off, we'll have Julie de los Reyes, who's a geographer and political economist, but she's currently at the Center of Southeast Asian Studies in Kyoto, University of Kyoto, and she's recently been a researcher at the Transnational Institute, which is a partner with EXALT. That'll be followed by Natacha Bruna, who's a political ecologist, and she's been at the ISS in Erasmus, Rotterdam, and she works on agrarian authoritarianism, land grabbing, extractivism, and I recommend her recent book, Land of Plenty, Land of Misery, Synergetic Land Grabbing in Mozambique. And then there's our very own Anja Nygren, who is Professor of Global Development Studies and a leading light and scholar in our own circles in EXALT, a key figure in our own immediate set of colleagues, a political ecologist and cultural anthropologist of some note and renown globally. And she has done a lot of work, a great deal of work on water, on forests, on nature and neoliberalism, on the vulnerabilities of communities, especially in Mexico and in Central America. So I'll leave it at that for the moment, and we'll turn it over to Julie. And let's hear what you got for us today, Julie. Thanks.
Thanks, Barry, for the introduction and for the invitation and opportunity to take part in this important conversation. Well, my work on extractivism looks at the nexus of mining and finance, in particular the influence of institutional investors such as hedge funds and pension funds that came to be the dominant shareholders in some of the world's largest gold mining companies. Many of these companies operate globally, and I look at it in the context of the commodity boom and bust cycle of that started in 2003. My main concern is to investigate how this ownership and the growing importance of these types of investors as sources of financing for the mining industry has influenced the activities of mining firms and its implications for places where minerals are drawn. Next slide, please. Mineral extraction is perhaps the quintessential example of extractivism. Understood in a limited sense, extraction refers to the physical process of moving resources from the natural environment. And in gold mining, we see this at work, from small artisanal mining that use very simple panning methods to the kind of large multi-million, if not billion, operations that leave indelible holes on the surface of the earth, as in the case of open cast mining, as you can see in the photo, or also in mines that run kilometers underground, such as those that we find in places like South Africa. The process requires the mobilization of materials from the subsurface, usually for the purpose of industrial use. Next slide, please. Mineral extraction could, however, also be more broadly defined, to quote Gavin Bridge, as a political economic process of expanding value and power via the identification, capture, and control of extractable materials. In the context of my own work, I consider how mineral extraction is intertwined with extraction of financial value, and how financial value, and with it power, can be derived from the control and appropriation of mineral resources. There is, of course, the idea that finance is very far removed from the material economy, and that the pursuit of financial value is something that is confined in the financial centers of New York or London. But I think a number of critical scholars have effectively challenged these claims. For one, some of the more recent work within geography by Brett Christophers, Mazen Laban, and Alex Loftus, for example, and many others have pointed out that even if we can argue that the locus of profiteering has to an extent shifted in the financial sphere, production still remains an important strategy, even for supposedly financialized entities. Thus, the pursuit of and the extraction of surplus value remains. The dominance of finance is a particular regime of accumulation, or what scholars have termed as financialization. And as it unfolded in the gold mining industry, engendered an aggressive expansion of claims to mineral resources in different geographical locations in the search for maximum surplus value. And this is done to support expectations of stock appreciations and rising dividend payments that, of course, accrue in the stock-denominated financial centers in the global north. Here, I find it particularly instructive, Moore's understanding of financialization as an ecological project, as a particular way of organizing nature for its purpose, and capitalism more broadly as an ecological regime. Financialization, I think, is extractive in much the same way that all capitalist industries is extractive, in that they are engaged in the extraction of minerals, which is the absolute materials, rather, which is the absolute objective condition of all productive activity, and in the extraction of surplus value. Next slide, please. So let me explain that thesis in the next slides. First is a background, what happened with the commodity boom that began in 2003. The commodity boom of 2003 to 2011 is considered the longest recorded boom since the post-war period. And this took place at a time of not only strong demand from emerging economies, but also concurrent shifts in capital markets to one that is dominated by institutional investors. And this is a period that saw a tremendous rise in the gold price from about $250 per ounce in early 2000 to a near historic high of almost $1,900 an ounce in 2009, shortly after the financial crisis. A consequence of this is that, sorry, next slide. A consequence of this is that institutional investors have placed large bets in different investment channels to gain exposure to the gold price, including through stock holdings in gold mining companies. Thus, gold mining firms drew in institutional investors like hedge funds as shareholders. And as demand for gold stocks rose with these price appreciations, companies took the opportunity to raise funds by issuing additional shares. So from 2000 to 2011, gold mining companies raised an estimated $78 billion in new equity capital. And 78 billion might not seem like a lot of money, but considering that the gold mining industry is quite small and that the entire capitalization of that industry was only about 70 billion in early 2004. So $78 billion was pretty much a wealth shock for many of them. Barrick Gold, for example, which was the world's largest gold producer, went to capital markets twice for $4 billion and $3 billion in 2009 and 2013 to make the largest equity offerings in the history of the Toronto Stock Exchange. Gold mining companies attracted some of the more high-profile hedge fund managers in the financial world, such as Soros Fund Management, BlackRock, which is the world's biggest investment manager, Paulson Gold Funds, the largest gold hedge fund. And these are the type of investors that have heavily invested in companies like Barrick Gold, Goldcorp, and Kinross Gold, some of the sector's largest. As key sources of capital, institutional investors have directly contributed to the funding of gold mining activities through purchasing new stocks. As majority shareholders, this also positioned them to exercise strategic control over firm management. Next slide, please. Important to highlight is that institutional investors are quite different from regular shareholders. They are, for one, highly capitalized entities with very short-term investment horizons, and they also require above-market returns. By virtue of the size of the capital that they wield, they tend to directly intervene in the running of the businesses whose stocks they own. And within firms, they're also very well positioned to pressure or incentivize management to align their company activities with their objectives or investment objectives. The influence of institutional investors came to be expressed in the shareholder value turn in company management. There's a whole literature on financialization of the firm, and the shareholder value doctrine is considered a key manifestation of the financialization of the firm. So what does it mean exactly? Shareholder value basically instills in company managers a notion that the firm is ultimately beholden to shareholders as the ultimate owners of capital, compared to, let's say, other stakeholders in the company. So in order to maximize shareholder value, companies are expected to prioritize stock price movements, stock price appreciations, and rising dividend payments. Stocks and dividends effectively become the indicators of company performance instead of, say, the traditional measures of product market share. In my work, I look at some of the largest gold mining companies that are headquartered in Canada. These are Barrick Gold, Kinross, Agnico Eagle Mines, Goldcorp, and IAMGOLD. They have their stocks trading in the Toronto Stock Exchanges and New York Stock Exchanges. And these have been the primary listings for mining companies and the main exchanges for equity capital raising for gold in the past decades. These companies, as you could also see, have been the recipients of institutional shareholder investments and display high levels of institutional shareholder ownership at over 50%. And they are also primarily responsible for the production segment of the supply chain, and they hold several mineral operations spread in different countries and continents. Next slide, please. What I wanted to see is how shareholder value maximization was operationalized by these companies. And I would argue that it ushered in important operational realignments and not only financial, with very real implications for growth, production, and its spatial organization. There are, as mentioned previously, essentially two key indicators of shareholder value. One is the appreciations in stock prices, and the other is rising dividend payments. Let me break it down a little bit. By purchasing stocks, institutional investors basically can gain from stock price movements and share in company profits through dividends. Stocks are title claims that give the holders a stake in the company's future value. And as Marx noted, such claims are ultimately fictitious in that they have a propensity to diverge from the actual surplus value realized. They move independently and they can be traded freely with only the potential basis or with only potential value as basis rather than something that is already produced. And in the case of gold mining firms, stock valuations are basically approximations of the entire lifetime of the firm. And this is coterminous with the mine life of their projects and operating mines. And in an industry where you depend on a depletable resource and mines that have limited lives, a mining company must basically continue to have a pipeline of projects in order to demonstrate its future viability. And this is the basis of company claims to stock appreciations and dividends. Thus, companies aim to replace, if not grow the reserves they extract in a given year by either growing organically, that is by searching for the resource through exploration, or by merging or acquiring other companies. But the ability to meet yearly production targets is read as indicative of cash flows from which dividends as a portion of company's surplus value are derived. Thus, the drive to real accumulation in this regard necessarily coexists alongside fictitious capital. Shareholder value is therefore realized independently from production in the sense that it is only tenuously linked to future production and through production. So shareholder value maximization can be considered a claim to maximum surplus value in a dual sense. It is one, an assertion of ownership to that which has yet to be realized, and secondly, to that which is already produced. I would argue that understanding these dynamics reveal how mineral extraction and particularly resource geographies are enrolled in the pursuit of shareholder value. Since value claims are very much tied to place in the physical location of production, companies are compelled to search out the particular configurations of place that can deliver maximum shareholder value. And this manifested in geographical restructurings, with finance capital reframing the parameters of mineral extraction as commodity prices shift and or as expectations on the realization of value changes. Next slide, please. Thus, during the boom years, During the boom years, there was an aggressive expansion, which was the favored strategy of choice because institutional investors pushed for rapid growth as a steep rise in the price of gold kind of raised the expectation that an increase in production would generate higher profit margins. And geographically, this saw companies venturing into new territories. To give a concrete example, Kinross acquired Redback Mining for 7.1 billion, which was funded through the issuance of new shares. And it established its presence in West Africa, which was billed at the time as one of the fast emerging gold regions in the world. And in fact, acquisitions ensued with higher frequency as a favored means to grow. Acquisitions are also executed through stock markets, but it allows firms to secure their claims to quality assets in strategic regions this way. As a growth strategy also, it immediately adds ounces, meaning you don't have to go and spend time exploring for the metal. You instead acquire another company in order to add ounces to your reserves. But of course, this comes at a high cost, and companies need sufficient financial backing to do this. And this is where institutional investment came in, and it proved quite instrumental. A total of 186 acquisitions from 2000 to 2012 took place, and several of them are multi-billion dollars worth, which are some of the largest in mining history. And as one company recounted in its annual report, they said that in the years leading up to the global financial crisis, rising gold prices and booming equity markets created a mood of euphoria among investors, rewarding gold producers that delivered aggressive production growth no matter what the costs. The boom period was also a time when dividends grew exponentially and were disbursed with higher frequency, most significantly from 2006 and 2012, with companies switching sometimes to monthly or quarterly payments. Second thing I want to highlight here is that the bid to expand and expand quickly heightened the competition for identified gold projects. By that, I mean those that are predominantly gold in their mineralogical composition. Since institutional investors purchase gold mining stocks as a proxy to holding the gold bullion itself, gold has to be the main commodity upon which production and earnings depended in order for it to track closely the gold price. Thus, company managers ensure that no more than 20 to 25% of their total production is attributable to another commodity in order to qualify as a gold play for investors. As one VP of a gold mining company that I interviewed said, to find a shareholder that wants your exact mix, copper and gold, for example, is more challenging. If you want somebody who wants a pure play of gold, it is much easier. We are constantly looking at that, but it will be more difficult for us to diversify further because this other mineral represents a sizable chunk of the business already. I think in this sense, it shows that the bid by gold mining companies to expand while ensuring a mainly gold profile also shows that there is a very conscious attempt to organize production to cater to the investment functions of gold mining stocks. Thirdly, since shareholder value is necessarily premised on particular place-based configurations that make for differential profit, the variations in taxation regimes, energy costs, transportation wages, political risk, and resource quality, all of these have to be factored in, and these mediate shareholder value expectations. The increase in gold mining activities has encountered, as you know, significant opposition in many countries. In fact, it registered the highest incidence of workers' strikes in 2009 to 2011. And a number of major gold projects such as El Moro and Pascualama in Chile have been suspended, which forced a greater awareness of the shifting risk-reward ratio of particular geographies. For some of these projects, they had to be shelved, which illustrates the potential to disrupt capitalist attempts to accumulate further. But in others, there have also been negotiations in some of the costs attached to operating in particular locations in ways that accommodate a company's target returns. When the gold price fell in 2011, there was a dramatic reversal in the capital commitments made during the boom years. From the speculative highs of the boom period, the adjustment to crisis, which is basically when stock valuations have to be or are rather forced into equilibrium with their underlying value in production, the result was just as disruptive. Since, and this is where I think we can see the contradictions that Marx have been talking about in how capitalist firms or capitalism works, in that capitalist firms compete in the sphere of exchange. So with gold mining firms and shareholders, they lock their views on the revenues that a given level of production will fetch at a prevailing gold price, and against which they adjust their strategies rather than fully committing to the production process of actually getting gold out of the ground. And this results to devaluation and withdrawal of capital. And as during the boom years, I would argue that the adjustment to crisis also necessitated another round of spatial reconfiguration. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. I'll focus here on the third part. I think I've dealt with the first two sections previously. Well, the adjustment to crisis, as I was saying, force a reassessment of the portfolio of mines that are being held by gold mining companies. And one of the things that they did is to classify operating mines and mineral projects as core or non-core on the basis of stricter conditions and returns to invested capital. And this classification then informed decisions on whether they're going to expand or intensify their operations, if they're going to close the mine or forestall the project or sell it. And for non-core assets that have been sold off or closed, the money is used to pay money back to shareholders or to service other financial commitments such as debt. On the other hand, identified core assets and projects that are considered integral to preserving, if not maximizing, shareholder value have been the focus of capital spending and form the basis of present and future earnings, which is then the foundation of a new round of extraction and recovery. And the restructuring is illustrative, in a sense, of the shifting spatial conditions of shareholder value. But it also shows how particular resource geographies can serve as a fix, a temporary kind of resolution to capitalist crises. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, there are three main takeaways that I wanted to highlight in my presentation. One is that shareholder value maximization fueled and constrained the spatial possibilities of resource extraction. I think we saw during the boom years, this translated to an aggressive expansion globally. And after, there was a dramatic pullback also on the geographical spread of mining activity, with preference for identified core mines and projects that are integral to shareholder value. Thus, the effects are expressed unevenly and experienced differentially also across many mineral geographies. Resource extraction is constitutive of value maximization and integral to the reproduction of finance capital. In the sense, the distinct resource geographies that I've mentioned are also not only intertwined, but during the crisis period, it also during the boom and bust cycle, we can also see how they contribute to the wealth accruing to financial centers. Finally, financialization, I think, can be construed as a particular form of global extractivism. For me, it's an ecological project of producing nature in a particular way, and whose spatial conditions of possibility is also global, although uneven. The interlinkages between financial practices, of course, and the very places where value is drawn is not always evident. And part of the challenge, I think, is to make these linkages visible or more explicit, and I think this could form the basis for thinking through alternative or effective forms of resistance and alternatives. I think I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much, Julie, for that really impressive, insightful, rigorous analysis. So if people weren't with us right at the start, but the order of procedure here is that just after the talk, we'll allow a couple of questions from the chat. If people have like a specific question they want to ask Julie, because then we'll have time later on for a much broader discussion. Okay, so if there's something in the chat there, our chat monitors, are there some, or just if anyone wants to put one in?
We currently don't yet have any questions or comments on the chat.
Okay.
They're welcome, but
yeah, let's see if anyone wants to put one in there just now. Give you a moment. Okay. No?
Not yet. No.
Okay then.
Maybe we can go on.
Thanks, Julie. We'll go on. And so now, Natacha.
Thank you, Barry. Well, hello, everyone. Today, I'll talk about my understandings regarding green extractivism. This will be done in the context of the current global environmental crisis. And it is actually a work in progress. So your feedback will be very useful at this point. So next slide, please. So before I go into climate change and green extractivism, I would like to position myself within the debate of extractivism. Because as we know, the concept of extractivism is still very debatable, sometimes not very coherent or not very stable. So whether we're talking about extractivism or extractivisms or global extractivisms, even across disciplines, there are some converging points that should be pointed out and that might be helpful to our understanding. And I think some of the points have already been discussed throughout this symposium. So the first one would be that extractivism is based, or generally there should be a relationship between actors or groups. It can be regions, it can be countries, people, or corporation, and so on. And the second one is that this relationship implies an exchange or a transfer of something, a commodity, knowledge, something that is tangible or intangible. And one of the key characteristics here is that this exchange is usually characterized as unbalanced. They're usually unilateral takers, actors that are taking everything, or actors that are taking or gaining more than other actors. So this exchange is characterized as asymmetric, exploitative, unfair, and with uneven distribution of gains and losses. Another key feature is control, meaning that some set of actors have higher control over these commodities or the thing that is being exchanged or extracted. And finally is the fifth one that I think is important to talk about is the interconnectivity, meaning that these relationships and exchanges have different levels of interconnection and intersection between the global and between the local level. So the global and the local level are constantly shaping each other and feeding each other. Next slide, please. So for my presentation, I would like to clarify, and even for my research in general, that I'll be using the political economy approach in which extractivism is related with accumulation, production, and appropriation of nature. Starting with the assumption that extractivism as a process that feeds accumulation through differentiated ways of removing and appropriating nature, but also taking in account labor exploitation as well. Next slide, please. Well, now that I've clarified my theoretical understanding and position, I'll talk about my case, which is in Mozambique. But I will start by contextualizing climate change and how climate change was put at the center of policies around the world. What we see today is that climate change debates and policies has become mainstream or in global. So the global economy today is becoming greener than ever. So being green or being environmentally friendly has become the new trend. And throughout the whole value chains, we can see processes of production, packaging, distribution, and markets are now aiming to reduce emissions. They're turning greener, or so they claim. Consequently, what happens is that we see the implementation of a range of environmentally friendly investments, whether it is in agriculture or clean energy projects, or even specific projects to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And this we see mostly or predominantly in the global south, and particularly in African countries. Next slide, please. So in this context, the 2010 report of the World Bank called for a climate smart world, meaning that there should be, meaning that climate smart policies should be implemented. So mainstream institutions such as the World Bank, such as the UN, the FAO, and the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, they strongly suggest, they strongly advise, and even finance the implementation of climate smart policies such as climate smart agriculture, REDD+, green investments such as forest plantation and biofuel production. Next slide, please. And there is a strong implementation of these policies in African countries because Africa is pointed out both as a very vulnerable to climate change, but also as with a strong potential regards to biodiversity. So Mozambique in particular is one of these cases. Mozambique presents a number of risks regarding climate change. As you can see, it is located in the East Africa, and the location itself makes Mozambique one of the most vulnerable countries to natural disasters, among other risks such as decrease in food production and so on. But on the other side, Mozambique is also very strong in terms of biodiversity potential. Around 25% of national territory has conservation potential. So this combination of vulnerability and biodiversity potential makes Mozambique a great receiver of climate funds and a strategic destination for climate change adaptation and mitigation policies. Next slide, please. So for this study, I looked at two of the most implemented in Mozambique, and this is the REDD+ and Climate Smart Agriculture, or CSA. The REDD+, as you might know, aims at reducing emissions through different financial mechanisms using reforestation or even conservation. On the other hand, CSA aims basically at three objectives: sustainably increasing productivity, building resilience to climate change, and reducing or removing greenhouse gas emissions, all of that from the agricultural sector. Next slide, please. So I will start with the first case, which is the Gilet National Reserve. This area, well, the REDD+ was implemented in this area, and by the World Bank and some development agencies, and they claim that the rural households that were living in the surroundings of the reserve, the so-called buffering zone, that they should use the land in a way that is compatible with conservation, and they shouldn't use forest resources anymore. So clearly there was a rupture in the households' forest-based strategies of livelihoods. This is because the livelihoods of these households were based in the access to forest resources, including water, including hunting and fishing. This was basically the main source of food and protein that these households had. So to compensate this loss of forest resources, these actors that implemented the REDD+, they suggested that climate-smart agriculture should be used to compensate for the loss of the forest resources. So they distributed seeds and they provided extension services, forcing the households to change their ways of farming to be more environmentally friendly, according to them, of course. But the data collected on the field indicates that this did not compensate for the loss of livelihoods, and it is actually a strategy to protect the biodiversity of the reserve, because the main goal here is carbon sequestration, and then to sell carbon permits in international markets, basically to multinationals or in industrialized countries. So what is happening is that the rights of emission are being transferred from rural population to industrialized regions. So we see here a creation of a new commodity that is carbon permits, and they're making profit out of it. And this new commodity is creating by cutting into the necessary consumption of rural livelihoods, because they have now diminished access to resources, including land and water, and they have diminished ability to produce food and cash crops. Next slide, please. So the second case, which is also part of the REDD+ strategy in Mozambique, the REDD+ strategy in Mozambique foresees the intensification of tree plantations. So in this context, this company, Portucel Mozambique, one of the largest agricultural investments in Mozambique, acquired over 350,000 hectares in the country, with the World Bank as a shareholder, and also as a technical advisor, basically to enforce the implementation of climate-smart agriculture. So what happened is that the company occupied the land without resettling the households, and this goes against the Mozambican land law, because they were supposed to identify and resettle the households that were expropriated. So instead of resettling, they negotiated with the government, and they said that we will provide climate-smart agriculture techniques to these households that were expropriated. So in other words, CSA comes as a way to compensate the loss of land incurred by the households. Well, of course, this was beneficial to the company because the company was able to get cheap land and was able to get cheap labor from the surplus population released by the expropriation process. So my findings show that many of the households ended landless or with small plots of land with no means to produce food. And the few who got the opportunity to work in the company, they claimed to be badly paid for the burden of work and stated that their salary is, as they call it, survival salary. Next slide, please. So thinking back on what I've said so far, what we see is the emergence of a new frontier of accumulation as climate change is further augmenting new forms of accumulation, is creating new commodities and new opportunities for accumulation by expanded reproduction. And if we have a closer look on all of this process since the beginning, we see that climate change was initially perceived as a threat to accumulation to a group of actors globally, but it has been now co-opted by global capital and integrated in global processes of accumulation. And all of this through further exploitation of rural livelihoods. Next slide, please. And this new frontier of accumulation comes with extractive features, I would say, and comes with processes of uneven distribution of gains and losses, which I called green extractivism. If we take, for instance, the case of REDD+ and the Gilet National Reserve, we see a clear example how a commodity was created and then extracted. So the further commodification of nature by putting a price on carbon credits and then expropriating it resulted in the loss of rights to emissions held by the smallholders. So they lost their right to emit because they no longer can use forest resources, and they're forced to change their farming techniques in order to accommodate carbon sequestration and pollution somewhere else in the world. So this is clearly an unfair exchange. And on this slide, you can see tentatively the value chain of carbon from the production of carbon credits with the implementation of REDD+, that involves expropriation of resources and emissions, from the rural poor all the way to the consumers, who are basically multinationals and industrialized countries who will buy carbon permits in order to keep polluting somewhere else in the globe. And you can see that all the way throughout the commodity chain, a lot of other actors are also profiting or gaining economically through because of this green extractivism. Next slide, please. Well, finally, I bring here some preliminary conclusions. Something that is important to underline is that green extractivism can go hand in hand with further commodification of nature. In the case of REDD+, for example, what is being extracted and transferred are emission rights. But this variation of extractivism does not necessarily imply direct environmental degradation at the local level. At the local level, what we see is that the ability to social reproduction and the resources needed to social reproduction are actually being taken away from the rural population. Nevertheless, if we see at the global level, we see that green extractivism actually implies indirect degradation of the environment. And this happens, as I said before, when corporations somewhere else in the globe buy the permits and then operationalize their activities. Overall, the transfer of emission rights provides opportunities of accumulation at the cost of rural populations' livelihoods and the rights to emit. For now, that's all, and thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Natacha, for that brilliant presentation. I think the two presentations have got quite a lot of common ground, so we can get back to in the latter part of the discussion today. But again, if there's anything in the chat there, Stana, if someone wants to raise a direct question for Natacha.
Yeah, we right now have a question from Ngomo, which is a bit more of a general question of the definitions with extractive. So maybe we can save that for the end of all of the presentations, maybe.
Or you can come back to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So
all right.
we'll type Ngomo, we're going to ask that.
All right, then. Thanks so much, Natacha. We'll be back soon. And then we'll go over to Anja Nygren. You ready, Anja?
Yes.
Okay, over to you.
Good afternoon for everyone. And thank you so much, Julie and Natacha. I really enjoyed listening to your presentations. And now I would like to continue presenting some of my ideas of global extractivism or global extractivisms as an analytical device. And I'm going to concentrate on interconnections across sectors, scale, and time. Next slide, please. So let me first explain a little bit what I mean by analytical devices. I think they are abstract constructions that help to explain certain phenomena. They offer ways to think through, understand, and generalize the data. As Howard Becker once said, without analytical devices, you do not know what to look, where to look it, and how to recognize what you were looking for when you find it. So they are like generalized statements that apply to phenomena and cases in general, rather than just to particular cases or people here and now, or there and then. However, although they are general statements, analytical devices also change to a certain degree historically and contextually. If we just consider, for example, the historical changes in our understanding of race, or as Eduardo Cudinas was saying on Wednesday, the term extractivism has gone fairly big changes during the decades. Myself, I'm quite, as an anthropologist, I do quite empirically based research. And I consider that analytical devices are always developed in dynamic interaction with empirical findings. This dialogue with empirical data is important because whenever you find facts that are ignored in conventional thinking, it might be that you have found characteristics that need to be incorporated in the definition of the phenomenon under study. Next slide, please. Here I want to concentrate on how to understand extractivisms as an analytical device. And I prefer plural instead of singular, so extractivisms. And the reason is that in this way, it is possible to analyze specific characteristics of different sectors, but also to explore the dynamic interconnections. I have listed here several areas that I consider as key areas of extraction, like hydrocarbons and mining, frontiers and land grabbing, like agricultural plantations, tree plantations and bioeconomies, green grabbing and bioprospecting, hydropower and water grabbings, fisheries, waste and recycling, and then extraction of immaterial resources and human mind. Next slide. Some people, considering this, that I also include extraction of immaterial resources in my definition, some people are asking that can we also consider knowledge appropriation as a sort of extractivism? But my question here is that how can we separate the appropriation of knowledge from natural resource exploitation? Think, for example, how GIS technologies are used in large-scale fishing or artificial intelligence in oil drilling. Now, using global extractivisms as an analytical device, we can better understand not just different sectors, but their complex interconnections, overlappings, and cumulative effects. Here I give just a few examples. Mining and shale oil drilling consume much water. They also have high impacts on water quality. In northern Mexico, in arid areas where there are problems with water scarcity, these two activities overlap, and thus they have very strong impact on local residents' livelihoods and living conditions. In southeastern oil regions in Mexico, small-scale fishing and oil extraction, although they do not compete over the same resources, they compete and overlap. They overlap and compete over the same resource space. In the case of hydrocarbons and bioeconomies, instead of considering bioeconomies just as sustainable replacement of carbon economies, there are complex issues to be considered in post-carbon economy, post-carbon energy extraction. For example, requirement of space, new infrastructure, and what happens to existing oil infrastructures. Are the areas of oil extraction and processing going to turn to certain kind of coast areas with any compensations for the local residents? Concerning the future need of energy in the world, current estimates state that the artificial intelligence consumes about 10% of the world's electricity. Companies such as Google or Facebook are nowadays some of the biggest consumers of renewable energy. If this development continues, there will be big winners and big losers in the use of wind and solar energy in the near future. Next slide. I have explained some of the issues that come to my mind concerning the different sectors, their interconnections, their overlappings, and accumulative effects. Here I want to turn to interconnected scales, which is a highly important question related to how to study extraction. In this conference, we have already had much discussion at which level we should focus, for example, when analyzing the impacts of extraction. And why I bring scales here is that I want to speak of global extractivisms instead of just extractivisms. And here I follow some scholars in political and economic geography who have recently emphasized that global is not just synonymous to international. Instead, global is the dimension that goes through all societal scales. And this gives us opportunities to see how different scales are interconnected in such a complex ways that even analytically, it's often difficult to separate them. For this reason, I'm very interested in analyzing politics of scale rather than scales as such. For example, how defining particular extractive operations as occurring at a certain scale is part of the politics of scaling. And as the actors have differentiated opportunities to engage in politics, we have a mosaic of interlayered scales, wherein the politics of scale are also politics among, across, and within scales. Next. I cannot go very deep in this question of scales, but I want to give just very simple examples of my own research. The first example is on conflicts over oil extraction in southeastern Mexico. Since the oil boom of 70s, dozens of peasant communities and ejidal lands in the state of Tabasco, one of the key areas of oil extraction in Mexico, have felt drastic changes in their lives and livelihoods, with many problems of air, soil, and water contamination, and many kinds of environmental, social insecurities and unknowns. Next. In addition to wide-ranging implications for local ecosystems and livelihoods, the oil's technological and political economic impacts move along the global production consumption networks. The oil drilled at remote peasant communities in Tabasco is transported through pipes to northern Mexico and from there to Houston, USA for further processing, and then back to Mexico again for retail distribution. Next. Another example of the importance of scales comes from my research related to hydropower dams. In addition to oil extraction, Mexican governments have promoted since the 50s huge hydropower projects as icons of development in this same region in Tabasco. Currently, there are 4 dams in operation on the River Grijalva with a total capacity of almost 5,000 megawatts and a 5th in planning. The inadequate operation of dams for electricity production for peak times in northern Mexico and for profit maximization was one of the reasons for catastrophic floods in the city of Villahermosa in 2007, when 62% of the city was inundated. Next. Socially differentiated water and electricity distribution and flood governance have increased unequal distribution of vulnerabilities. In my research project, we have organized workshops on social cartographies, in which local residents map the risk zones and tell about their experiences of disasters, feelings of injustice, and efforts of recovery. So I hope these two examples revealed a little bit how different scales are so articulated and embedded that it's difficult often to separate them. Next. In addition to interconnections between sectors and scales, I want to emphasize one aspect which perhaps we haven't been speaking so much in this conference, and it's about effects over time. In order to, I think it's important to develop devices also to analyze continuities and discontinuities over time. Especially because we know that many of the extractive operations have a trajectory of booms and busts. So, in my research, I have been very interested in the historically changing modalities of resource extraction and continuities and changes in the forms of governance. In our recent articles published in Annals of American Association of Geographers and another one in Geoforum, we provide evidence how clientelist and market-based practices, forms of state authoritarianism, private regulation, and neoliberal outsourcing are strategically mixed in the governance of oil extraction and hydropower dams in Mexico. And this is mainly done in order to insulate extractive operations from public scrutiny and to diffuse questions of responsibility. Next. When I was studying links of farmers' livelihoods to multinational fruit plantations in northern Honduras, I knew that the banana plantations owned by transnational fruit companies had a long history in the region. What I didn't know so well was how long and complex history is the peasant and labor movement struggles for fairer distribution of land and other resources vis-a-vis these transnational companies in Central America. Next. Another example of the importance to have panel data when analyzing impacts of extraction over time. This map shows the accumulated forest loss for agriculture, pastureland, and scrubland, as well as for oil palm plantations in southeastern Nicaragua from 1985 to 2019. Often the peasants are blamed for forest clearing. However, when I examined these frontier politics by combining analysis of historical satellite images with ethnographic data, I noticed that there is an expansive resource appropriation and rapid profit-making for speculative cattle raising and agribusiness operations in this zone, provoking traumatic experiences of social dispossession among small-scale farmers. Next. Another example of why it is important to pay attention to changes and continuities over time is my ongoing research related to claims for compensation for land salinization and water contamination after mid-70s in the lowlands of Tabasco. Due to hydrological changes related to oil drilling and oil transportation, about 80,000 hectares of land were salinated in this area. Local resistance movements have struggled for decades to hold the oil industry accountable for the environmental social harms. Careful analysis of different sorts of archival data, together with documentary analysis and ethnographic interviews, reveals how governmental authorities and oil company representatives have employed complex strategies of political pressure and depoliticization to weaken the resistance and to trade off local claims for fair compensation. Next. A critical question in confronting environmental hazards and social injustices provoked by extensive oil extraction is also how to repair the drastically altered landscapes and livelihoods in such sacrificed zones. I do not have time to elaborate these questions deeply herein. I just want to emphasize that in the ways how people interpret the past, engage with the present, and imagine their future, different temporalities and experiences of injustice interlink in complex ways. Next slide. Here I just want this is my last slide, and I just want to briefly summarize that if we use global extractivisms as an analytical device, in my view, it offers us opportunities to explore variegated, contextually situated forms of extraction, their socially differentiated and socially differentiating effects, struggles over material resources and over symbolic meanings. I also would like to see, or at least by myself, to do research that links political and ecological very carefully with each other. So political ecologies instead of politics and ecology, so that we really try to understand how biophysical and socio-political aspects are interconnected. Then it offers good opportunities to understand continuities and changes across time, linkages within, among, and across scales, similitudes and differences across sites, so that we can understand wider patterns and systemic changes. And then we also need, as Barry was saying at the beginning, we also need transformative alternatives, and they need to be carefully investigated also in the future. These alternatives, they are often unnoticed or made insignificant, but there are important alternatives. And I want to end here by saying that we definitely need multi-scholar changes. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Anja. That was really brilliant. And now there's so much going on between the three papers. So once again, we'll get to that in a moment. And but just now, is there anything in the chat for questions directly to Anja?
Directly to Anja, no.
Okay. And we have our co-facilitator, Marcus Kroger, here with us. Marcus, do you want to say hello?
Hello, everybody. Yeah. Yes. So maybe I can say some questions that I have now for the presentations. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. And this was exactly what we were thinking about when devising this session on global extractivisms, which should go beyond just looking at one type of extractivism in a particular place, but say something more broader about current global transitions and tendencies, and also explore this new concept of global extractivisms and what that might mean in different sectors and maybe between those sectors. So maybe first about the goal, that was really fascinating to hear about that kind of change in the goal global gold extractivist sector that is going towards like turning the gold companies into just gold producing companies. And I was thinking that, could you reflect, Julian, a little bit about what kind of potential power and political impacts that might have? I mean, might it become much more difficult to then tackle the negative impacts of gold when you have such a strong new vested interest and player, a component in that, for example, in portfolio management, then large investment funds want to have this in future also, these gold companies. And that, would you have some explanations for why we have such high gold prices right now in the middle of the pandemic? I mean, the record high prices. Yeah, and also I would like to ask that what major changes have there been in the sources of gold in the past 15 years when this transformation has been happening in terms of the gold capital that you mentioned? So where has most of the new gold come from, for example? And after that, maybe I could ask questions from the others.
Excellent questions. Well, with gold, I think the important thing to say also is that gold is quite a different commodity. It's moved by a different set of factors that move others. For example, copper and many other minerals, these are mainly for industrial use. For gold, however, the destination of gold is practically jewelry, or as investment demand, or as a central bank reserve. And the peculiar thing about gold, of course, is that it's not a commodity that is consumed in the traditional sense. That is, all the gold that we have dug up still exists. And for all the money that is being thrown out there chasing gold and the interest in gold mining, that supply is actually just about 1.5 to 2% annually of already existing gold reserves. So much of it, an inordinate amount of it, is actually above ground. And the thing that creates an impetus for gold extraction is basically whether we liberate that supply above ground or we keep it. And I think the past 10, 15 years, what has really altered the course of gold extraction is the fact that many of the central banks decided to hold on to their gold. In 1999, this wasn't the case. The UK decided to sell off its reserves, and actually they thought that this is the end of gold mining as they know it. The gold price was about 250, and it's not supportive of the cost of gold extraction. Then, of course, because the UK decided to sell its gold, that means it has implications for the wealth held by many Western governments. And many governments in Europe are resistant to this. So they decided to forge an agreement that they are going to coordinate the selling of gold. And this is an agreement that they signed for which was renewed every 5 years. But the consequence of that agreement is that it basically limited the amount of gold that is going to be released at any given time so that it doesn't dampen the price. So then in 2004, of course, one of the key things that happened is that China decided to, let's say, democratize the holding of the gold bullion. So there was tremendous investment demand that came from the new booming middle class. And that immediately increased the demand for investment. So before, I think it wasn't until since the 1950s, in China, you are not allowed to hold a gold bullion for private use, but that has been reversed. So I think the combination of sequestering supply through the central bank agreement and the resurgence of demand are the two key drivers that made gold mining a very lucrative activity. And then, of course, in 2008, 2009, because of the crisis, gold moves counter-cyclically to the economy. And so many central banks again decided to hold on to their gold and in fact started purchasing more gold. So thus adding to demand for it. So I think there's a whole set of factors above ground, well beyond the hole in the ground, that we have to factor in when we think of gold extraction and also extractivism broadly in that sense. And with gold, this is one of the reasons also why there was a lot of speculation, and the strength of that speculation is based on these very material things that move it. And they felt that these are things that make it a very good and fairly solid investment. And this found its way in mining stocks, as I was saying, which then translated into an increase in gold mining activities globally. Secondly, the major sources of gold, the supply, as I was saying, it's only like about 1.5% to 2% annually. But because the largest supply, about 1/4 of total gold supply, is just there and kept in vaults. So we basically dug it out of the ground and then put it in vaults, right? So 1/4 of that having been sequestered, that means that the only supply effectively comes from mining and also from, to an extent, recycling. So those are the two key sources of supply in the past years. And more recently, of course, with the coronavirus crisis, gold has started to appreciate again. And again, this is largely because of gold traders that, of course, seek gold as a sort of hedge to their investments. Many of these large institutional investors hold gold as a sort of offset to the other portfolio of assets that they hold that move cyclically. So gold will kind of help buffer them in case that there is a crisis. So again, we see that kind of dynamics at play during this period.
And I think we have a question from Maria Enström Fuentes directly to Julie about the gold prices. Isn't gold directly dependent on the trust in the dollar as a global trading monetary? And much of the speculation on gold has to do with speculations of whether the dollar will remain the global currency of trade. And this would explain part of the drastic increase in the value of gold in these uncertain times. So commented a little bit on that, but.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, because in the 1970s, of course, when countries decided to end the gold standard, that means that gold moves counter-cyclically to the US dollar. So many speculators also watch, for example, US monetary policy and that how that is going to impact gold prices. But it's not the only thing that moves gold, and there's a host of other factors. For example, one of the biggest sources of demand is jewelry, and this is almost largely driven by the growing demand from East Asian countries and the growing middle class in this region. Yes.
Okay, Marcus.
Okay, great, thanks. And yeah, wonderful to see you, Natacha, also here. Many thanks for joining us. Very, very exciting. Thanks for the concept of green extractivism. That was really fascinating. Yeah, I think that's really important to emphasize, like you say, that this would be carbon credit extraction and not creation through this concept. So I was wondering, what else would you include within this new category of green extractivism, if you would have some thought on that, or green extractivisms, if you would like to share some thoughts on what would be the main cleavages or main subcategories of different kind of green extractivisms. And then how would you see the difference of this concept with the concept of green grabbing as an analytical tool? Or what leverage does green extractivism has as a concept in comparison with green grabbing as a kind of new iteration following the developments within these broader fields? And then finally, maybe I could ask from you also that you studied the REDD+ and climate smart agriculture in Mozambique, but would you see that these same dynamics apply more globally? Could they be called globally green extractivist projects?
Thank you, Marcus. It's also good to see you here. Well, yeah, the first question was about the what else would I include in green extractivism? Well, as I said before, talking about green extractivism, I was contextualizing in terms of climate change, mitigation and adaptation policies. There are a lot of policies and projects being implemented in the name of mitigating and adapting to climate change all over the world, and especially in global south countries, as I said before. And I think maybe this category or this variation of extractivism would be present in other policies and projects that are going on. We have, even in Mozambique, we have some schemes of payments of environmental services in which households, rural households that live, always has to do with a green project because they live close to a national park. It's not a reserve, but it's a national park. And they also live in the buffering zone and close to the buffering zone. And then they receive cash in exchange to planting trees. And this also goes through a process of measuring carbon sequestration and all of these things. So I think most of these policies that are aimed to mitigate and adapt to climate change can have also this nature of green extractivism. Of course, if we reflect about the concept, as I did in the one of the first slides that I showed, I think it's possible to identify features of green extractivism in most of these climate change mitigation and adaptation policies. I would question, for example, if biofuel production is also part of this category. I think I would have to reflect a bit more in the whole process and identify who are the actors, what is being exchanged, what is being grabbed, because I think the extractivism framework is directly related with the resource grabbing and land grabbing and also green grabbing concepts. So by reflecting on who are the actors, what is being exchanged, how asymmetric that is, and who is controlling what, who is controlling the ownership or the flows of the commodities, we can come across these definitions of green extractivism and identify these processes as green extractivism. So I think it's still, I would say, a new concept and probably a new field to reflect about and try to, as Anja was saying, because we learn a lot with empirics, right, by doing field research, and by doing that, I think we can get a further understanding and other variations of green extractivism. And I will relate this answer with your second question, which was related to green grabbing. How is green extractivism related with green grabbing? I think they're highly related, because green grabbing is basically the appropriation of resources to environmental ends. And this is exactly what happens, for example, in REDD+. And this is exactly what happened in one of the cases that I brought here, which is the Gilet National Reserve. So resources are being grabbed, which is forest resources, are being grabbed in the name of environment. So that's green grabbing. But further than that, what I want to understand is what are the implications of grabbing these resources? Where are these resources going, right? And then we start to talk about scale, not only in terms of local analysis or global analysis, but also in terms of societal scales, like economically, socially, even financially. What are the implications of that? So what are these resources being grabbed for? So this is where green extractivism comes, I guess, because they're being grabbed, they're being not only grabbed, but extracted to other actors that are gaining economically from those resources. And the third question is that I'm applying this concept to Mozambique, and if I think that this can globally be applied or in other, well, of course, I think I brought here a case to sustain this concept that I'm trying to develop. But I think in a lot of countries where REDD+ or climate smart agriculture are being implemented, or other related policies with climate change and as a solution to the environmental crisis might be in this category as well. I've seen studies from Tanzania, for example, and also some countries in Asia that are also going through these processes. So I think it's very applicable globally. Thank you.
Great, wonderful, thanks. And maybe just a few words also to Anja. So I think this was crucial what you mentioned between the distinction between this data or intangible, tangible extractivisms, that it's like a false dichotomy. So I appreciate if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on that, because we have here had different sessions on for example, the data side or so on. So if you could share your insights on that, on those linkages, and then maybe comment on the other presentations, and the other presentations could comment each other, if that's okay.
So can you explain a little bit more what you mean by intangible and tangible?
Well, if there is this idea that there would be, like, there was a poll in the opening plenary, if people consider extractivism to be linked only to the natural resources or not. So what's your take on that discussion?
Well, I think that we started with a certain kind of understanding of extractivism as an overexploitation or overextension of natural resource exploitation. And that's the core issue, but it's difficult to stay in that area only, because what I think has become very clear in this conference, in other instances, is that we cannot just like focus on natural resource exploitation. We also have to think about all the politics, all the mindsets involved, the profit making, the nature commodification, the symbolic aspects of politics and how they relate. But still, I would like to, because if you use extractivism as an analytical device, if we open it so that everything is extractivism, then the device loses its analytical power. So somehow it's also important to have a certain kind of quite clear understanding what extractivism is and what it is not. But at the same time, I also want to say that the concepts and devices, they change through history. When more investigation is done, we get more aspects and more inspirations and more understandings.
I think Marcus was indicating, invite you now to speak with each other, the three presenters, in any manner you wish to just now, either to make a comment about, reflect on something that was one of the other speakers presented, or ask a question, just between yourselves there for a while. Just anybody amongst you three. Okay.
I think Anja's point about, well, basically paying attention to space and also how extractivism has changed over time and differences between sectors, I think is very relevant and something that I also had to grapple with in my research. Because when I look at how gold mining companies strategize about how to create maximum value from their operations, I see very different approaches. There's no one set strategy. And this confounded me a lot because sometimes the literature on, say, financialization or corporate financialization, it's quite rigid on the idea of how firms are supposed to comply or how firms are supposed to maximize value to shareholders, which is basically selling off parts of the business by increasing dividend payments, et cetera, and in many cases it doesn't always quite fit. So I think it's very important to bring out some of these nuances, but at the same time to also see what the broader trend might be and what could be the unifying thing that could explain why the difference in these strategies. So I think methodologically it's not always easy. And, especially like jumping scales, I think, to sort of understand what happens at the macro level. For example, the idea of finance, of course, is very much considered as just out there, that is happening in New York, London, etc. And to try to connect it to the local level on why these things are happening in places like Chile, etc. I think the connections are not always very clear. And I think as researchers, there's always this, difficulty, of course, to trace some of these processes when they are couched in very opaque industry-specific languages like shareholder value, etc., and unpacking what those things actually mean on the ground. Yeah.
I very much agree with that, and I think that the panel, like, I enjoyed how the presentations were coming together and how they were interrelated and kind of complementing each other, because they were very connected to each other. It's like it's a whole, and an interest. It is interesting how we can see the concept of global extractivisms coming out of our discussion, and how the different extractivisms that each of us approached are coming together. For example, when Julie was talking about how financialization is related to the patterns of mineral extraction, I automatically thought about my case and how also this financialization, extractivism and finance financialization as well, is related to green extractivism as well. They're interconnected because in Mozambique, as I said in my presentation, Mozambique became a great receiver of climate funds. So a lot of finance is going through RED+ and implementation of climate smart agriculture. And you can see clearly how these extractivisms come together and how these global dynamics are affecting the local dynamics, because this high levels of financialization going to environmental policies are shaping local processes of social reproduction, like how the livelihoods of households are being shaped because of these international and global concerns about climate change and about reducing emissions. And this is clearly have a lot of implications in the local level, in the households' livelihoods, rural livelihoods in Mozambique, in a specific region. And then how by extracting or by cutting into the necessary consumption of these households, global dynamics of accumulation are changing. So it's very interesting to see these different scales and how they come together and how they came together in our panel.
Yes, I think in our panel, what came very clear and interesting is that I think the presentations clearly showed what Markus was also saying in his presentation on was it on Wednesday, that in order to understand extractivisms, we also need to understand the specific characteristics of different sectors. And here we were speaking about gold mining, we were speaking about green extraction, and then my case is of oil extraction. And they are different sectors and they have very different specific characters, but they are also often interconnected. And also what we were speaking about scales and so on, I so much enjoyed Julie's presentation because you are expert in areas where I have weak capabilities, and I think this clearly showed that in order to understand global extractivisms, we need scholars from different disciplines, scholars working with different methodologies, maybe also with different theoretical approaches, in order to get a big picture and in order to understand the contextualized differences, but also the wider patterns and the systemic changes. And in this sense, I really enjoy also our group at the University of Helsinki, this EXALT initiative, because we have also like, we are scholars that come from different disciplines and that work at different levels, at different scales, still looking like scales interconnected. But this is the way how I think when you are studying extractivism, the multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, it's so obvious that you do not have to justify it.
Well, it may be obvious, but in some ways, one of the things that struck me about this discussion is that at a high level of abstraction, you can talk about the dynamics of a capital accumulation on world scale or accumulation on world scale. And how, in the sense, that is a fundamental driver of all sectors of extractivism. There are many other sources of capital accumulation in the global economy, of course, but what we've been talking about is our specific focus, right? And it's concretized through real studies, empirical studies of the various sectors, and recognizing that there's an enormous variation in sectors and practices, as you've been noting, right? But that still doesn't eliminate the idea that there are common dynamics which lead into the dynamics of capital. Like I say, it's kind of belaboring the obvious in a sense. But the other thing I saw in all the ways you were discussing is like, as a global dynamic of recent years and maybe much longer periods of time, as Anja was saying, the continuities, there does seem to be, like Julie mentioned Marx, I mean, that old idea of immiseration, well, maybe it's taking on somewhat new meaning today, you know, that the industrial proletariat may have been immiserated in 19th century factories in Britain and elsewhere, and they certainly were. But now we see a sort of new phenomena of immiseration affecting rural livelihoods, but it's capital operating globally, which is in a sense behind the drivers. And at the same time, increasing ecological, environmental degradation and destruction, you know, pushing the planetary boundaries to their absolute limit, as we now all know, and the science is overwhelming on that. So it's just some reflections, you know, that's about looking at it globally, not merely as like sectorally, but as quite linked up to what some people might call, you know, the whole system. Yeah. Okay, it's just a reflection. You don't have to answer that. Wasn't a test. I think we've got some more questions maybe from the chat.
Yes,
Sanna.
definitely. So I think we'll start with Ngomo's question. A while ago, he was asking, they were asking, how will the definition of extractives change if we go beyond structural and political economic boundaries? So when we, how will the definition change when we factor in social relationships, affections, moral values, and judgments within and between corporations and the people on the ground? Who wants to start?
Right. Anyone? Give it a moment. It's quite a yeah.
Well, I can perhaps start. I don't have a maybe so well formulated answer, but what I have been studying in recent times are the issues of environmental justice, and in that case, earlier times. Most of the attention was put on resource distribution, and I think that's still very, very crucial issue, and I would even like to put more attention on it than what has been put in recent years. But at the same time, there is much discussion that it's not just resource distribution and profit distribution, but it's also the question of institutional or cultural recognition, political representation, and maybe also recently I have been thinking also the social recovery and ecological repair. So those kind of questions I think are important to take into account. And what you were, Barry, saying about these aspects of ecological issues and so on. Still for some 10 years ago, I think most of us as social scientists, we were pointing out that only the ecological issues are taken into account and social issues are forgotten. For example, in different kind of development projects and interventions and so on. Nowadays, what is clear is that those environmental and social harms, they are so interlinked that we cannot separate them from each other. And for that reason, I think we as social scientists, we do not need to become natural scientists, but it's extremely important to pay attention also to environmental impacts, because you cannot separate them from social impacts. And there we also need to understand the characteristics of different sectors. What are the ecological, what are the social impacts of different sectors?
If I just reflect quickly, it's also to underscore politics, power relations, global power relations, and how they instantiate themselves in the local and provoke new kinds of contestations locally. Many different kinds of confrontations within communities, between the communities and the corporations, and even with global capital, with their own governments and authority. The state is reactivated as a terrain of struggle in which you can also activate the law, you can activate international alliances, you can change the narrative and the discourse, and you try to change the way the state behaves so that the state will actually act in favor of its own citizens, because that's part of the legitimation problem for the state, any state. So all these, there's the underscoring the politics of all this at every scale and how the scales interact, the interconnected scales, is also crucial to this kind of study, to avoid it just becoming kind of technical, narrow, economistic, and this kind of thing, which wouldn't be right. My view, just my view. So we have another question, I think. Oh, you want to, Natacha?
Yes, I would like just to say something, because I think, and even throughout this whole symposium, we saw that the concept extractivism and the framework as a framework as well it can mean a lot of things, and I think that's the beauty of the concept and of the framework. Everything seems suitable to be analyzed with this framework. So you can go beyond structures, you can go beyond appropriation of nature. So it can come and goes as suitable fits in a lot of things, in a lot of ways that we can analyze a problem. Even if we put together different theoretical understandings of extractivism at different scales across disciplines, we get a richer analytical framework to understand a specific problem, and we can even get a more consolidated and thorough conclusion. However, I would say that I find challenging to some extent, again, with the problem of the specificities that can get lost in the way. So I think that we have to make decisions, right? When we are focusing in a specific research topic or in a specific discipline, we have to make decisions whether we focus on one specific thing and lose the whole, or we choose a broader approach and eventually lose the specificities. So I think it's kind of a matter of making decisions, probably.
Should we go back to the chat?
We could, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we'll start with, there's a comment from Mariam Abbas. They're saying that thank you to all panelists for your presentations, and a special thank you to Natacha for bringing the relevant presentation on the Mozambican case. As she accurately referred, extractivism is very present, and in most cases, many of these green projects are used by the government and companies as good models or examples to follow. And without proper and deeper research, these models could be recommended and used as good examples. It is necessary to look at the implications of these projects on rural communities. So thank you for the insightful presentations from Mariam. And then Outi, I think Outi Hakkarainen asked that could Anja reflect and tell examples of transformative alternatives which we could and should search and act for?
Yes, I think in this conference we have had very many good presentations on transformative alternatives. We have better special experts in this aspect than me. But what I have been interested in is to try to understand, for example, in the case of post-carbon economies, that what are those political initiatives at different levels, like cross-level initiatives, how to repair those sacrifice zones that have been under the extensive hydrocarbon extraction for decades, how to repair the landscapes, but how to repair livelihoods and livelihoods. So this is, I think this could also be one of the transformative alternatives if we put our attention that these people, they have like all kind of experiences of sacrifice, but also of stamina. And it would be important to take them much better into account.
Thank you. And kind of related to that, we have a comment from Bonhueko saying, shouldn't we start our alternatives to extractivisms with a conceptual deconstruction of value? The problem is value extraction from the exploitation of human natural resources. In heterodox economics, there's now a call on the move from maximization of shareholder value to co-creation of value, from shareholder value to stakeholder value. The value question has implications for the productive, financial exchange and sociocultural dimensions of extractivisms across time, spaces and scales. Do you want to?
I think I'll address this one. Well, thank you, Bon, for your question. I think I definitely agree that at the heart of the question is, of course, value, and it's hotly debated within Marxist camps, of course. But the shift that you mentioned from maximization of shareholder value to co-creation of value, I mean, some would say that the problem is value per se, you know, full stop. The question is not about how value is distributed. I think many critical scholars have pointed out that we have to move beyond that question of value sharing, and if true value sharing can actually happen within a capitalist economy is a salient question. I think it's, you know, I don't have a fully formulated answer to it. I think it's a conversation. It's a long drawn conversation that we should be having. But I think at the heart of capitalist extraction is the pursuit of value, and under what conditions can this be just, I guess, is one of the questions that might arise when we consider the value question. And as you said, it has implications for productive financial exchange, social-cultural dimensions, etc. But you know, all capitalist value tends to supplant other value systems that are in place in other countries. So, sorry, I think I just got disconnected earlier.
Yeah, you're back.
So yeah, so definitely, I think it's a fundamental question, and yeah, we should talk more about this.
Yeah, but that also involves there's a lot of discussion around the planet about recommoning, decommodification, the social economy. You know, this is where the antipodal counter move comes to the hegemonic power of capital. And in a crisis like this, which is not just merely an abstract paradigmatic crisis amongst intellectuals, but it's, you know, it's ubiquitous, and it's felt everywhere, and there seems to be an intensification, which, you know, if you look back the past 4 decades, people have measured the material throughput in the global economy, which has just grown sort of, you know, is extrapolated at an alarming rate of orders of magnitude. So, you know, there are these kinds of, how far can you push this before counter tendencies, in a sense, become imperative? They're not, in their ways, they're imposed by the depth of the crisis dimensions themselves. People have been talking about it for many, many years. I mean, about, you know, will capital accumulation finally reach its ecological limits on a planetary basis? Would capital accumulation finally reach its social limits, its political limits? And when, you know, that when people, in fact, began to question the whole paradigm and rebel, and are open to a whole new paradigm. I mean, I'll stop there, but, you know, there's so many, the big corporations, I'll just add this, big corporations have gotten together, some groups of them, and said, oh, you know, we have to reject what Milton Friedman said should be the sole purpose of all corporations, which is to maximize the returns for their owners, for their shareholders and their ultimate owners, behind the veils and the curtains. A class of owners, you know, which we have information on increasingly, is a hugely concentrated class globally. I mean, let's talk about that's something to talk about, you know, oligarchization at a global scale, you know. And what they're talking about, you know, well, we're under so much pressure globally in so many different ways, including legitimation for their very existence as a firm, that they, you know, they want to appropriate the ideas about saying, well, yes, of course, you know, there are many other stakeholders, and we have to have many other functions, and we do have social responsibilities, and we say so, and also to future generations and so forth. Right? This is going on, right? This is happening. I'm not emphasizing it as something to celebrate, but it's there, right? So it's so many different ways. There's a pushback, a huge pushback already. We're seeing it in motion, right? It's happening. And that's where we twin. We have said in our group that, you know, there's absolutely no separation for us between empirical studies of global extractivisms and the idea that we are studying the dialectic with alternatives at whichever scale you might want to pose, right? You know, that they have to be together. So, because critique for critique's sake of global capitalism is, you know, has its limitations. So it's really about transformative praxis at many different scales of practice, of social action. We're interested in that as much as we are in the critique of global extractivisms.
At this point, I hate to be the buzzkill reminder that we do have only 5 minutes left of the whole session. We have, we can either, depending on Barry, how would you like to have this final talks, thoughts from the speakers, or
yeah, I think that's the fairest, best way.
yeah,
If they can reflect on the future of the field, I mean, taking from like when Natacha was saying that, you know, this global extractivisms and alternatives seems to be an interesting arena, what we sometimes call an organizing concept. I mean, I'm old enough, I remember that in the 80s, hegemony, I mean, coming out of Gramsci and many other, and international relations, hegemony was a kind of new, rediscovered organizing concept applied in so many different ways. It was a space for debate. Then came globalization, you know, and it became, some people wanted to say there was one received theory of globalization, which of course unscientific, ahistorical, essentialist, and tautological, all kinds of flaws in it. And we challenged that right away, but it became a space for debate. An organizing concept doesn't mean you have a consensus. There's never a consensus amongst academics about such complex matters, nor should there be. But it's a fruitful way of pushing questions, new research agendas, new studies, you know, new debates, new concepts. So I think if you could reflect on the future of the field, global extractivism, you know, what difference does it make to use this concept? What do you think?
Well, I think the extractivism has really taken so many different guises throughout history that saying it, using the term global extractivisms, I think highlights the plurality of these different practices, these modes of extraction. And I personally favor it as a concept. And in my work, for example, the financialization, I really cannot conceive of it as anything more than extraction, really. And of course, this is extraction of financial value in something, yes, arguably material, but there's a host of other modes of extraction that that have been used by gold mining companies also throughout these past decades, that I think the multiplicity of these practices should be recognized. And of course, at this current point in time, we are also at the cusp of, you know, dramatic changes internationally. And I think we're going to see a whole new round of extractions also as we try to shift to from a fossil fuel-based system, for example, to more renewable sources. So again, this is going to give birth to a whole new sets of practices, a whole new sets of ways by which value is going to be extracted in various ways. So I think the term global extractivism could potentially be a very powerful concept, to umbrella concept, to try to bring together these different things and also to tease out some of the commonalities and trends that are happening.
Okay.
Well, if I can continue, I really appreciate this that you emphasized, Barry, that it's important to interlink global extractivisms and transformative alternatives. And for future needs, future research, I think it's important that we really investigate transformative alternatives and not just transitions, which is what most of the state policies try. They just say you have to adapt to climate change instead of looking for transformations, structural transformations. I also want to emphasize that there are so many transformative alternatives, but the power relations are also very unequal. It's not easy to struggle against these huge interventions. What I also think yesterday somebody was saying that how about those alternatives, those initiatives, when they become very big ones, they are easily like made mainstream, and then they lose their power. So how to also protect those initiatives so that they do not become like institutionalized and mainstream. What I also think is important to investigate in the future more in detail is the role of the states, and how the state makings and corporates resource makings, how they interconnect, and what kind of hazards makings they are then promoting.
Yes, thanks. Natacha.
Yes, I'll try to be brief, but I just want to answer quickly for a question that was for me in the chat about the agency and role of local people in Mozambique. I spoke as if they don't have agency. Of course they have, but I didn't have time to go through that. But what I really wanted to underline here is that there is not a political reaction directly to green extractivism in Mozambique so far. Of course, we have a nationwide peasant movement, UNAC, in Mozambique, and they strongly advocate to agroecology, which is totally different from climate smart agriculture. So they're working towards that direction. And in terms of the reaction of the people that are being dispossessed and that go through this extractivism, they, of course, they don't agree with that. And so far, their resistance go along with Scott's everyday forms of resistance. They still go into the reserve, hiding and hunting and go back home. You know, they have these small ways of resistance, not small, but everyday forms of resistance. Regarding the future of the field, well, I think extractivisms, global extractivisms can be very broad and suitable to analyze a lot of things. And because of that, it can become overused, probably, overused to identify problems and to analyze this and make it difficult to find solutions if we see it as a very global or put everything in the analysis. So I agree very much with what Eduardo Godina said in the first session, that we should aim to develop differentiated understandings of extractivisms that tackle different problems so that you have ability to propose suitable alternatives. So I go more, unless we want to dismantle the whole system that we have so far. And the last thing that I wanted to underline about extractivisms and maybe the future of the field, or all of us as researchers, as academics, maybe to take time to reflect or to further explore the extractivist process of conducting field research. Because how different is that, what we're doing, from what we are criticizing, from the people that we are criticizing? So would that be academic, scholar extractivism? I'm not sure. I know there are some people that are already debating and discussing about that. And I think it's very important to reflect about that, because people in the field, they give us their time, their knowledge, their valuable insights, and they open their lives to us. And as researchers, we make a living out of that. Whether we like it or not, I think is problematic as well. So even if you try, for me, for example, as a scholar that aims social change, I can try and influence policies at the government level, like national or local level, but we're never sure how is this going to change their lives or not. So each time I do field work, field research, I feel that I'm extracting something that it's not compensated. So I'll close with that.
Yes. It's a fair point. We do discuss that quite a lot in our group in Helsinki, and it's recommended that everyone does. and to be embedded and have a genuine relationship of reciprocity with the people you're working with is a form of solidarity also, is something I would suggest is important for the co-construction of knowledge, to change the way academia works so that academia isn't extractivist and exploitative towards people it's working with around the world. It isn't right. I agree. So I think we've had a really good discussion. I thank everyone, absolutely. Great presentations, brilliant. Remember, this is recorded, so you can distribute it later to others. And thanks to Marcus for brilliant questions and everyone for participating. Okay, I think we're done.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Barry and Marcus.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Natacha.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.